Welcome back to another episode, or installment rather, of our look at Acts 15. My name is Caleb Haig. I'm the director of Pronomian.com, and you can find all sorts of resources there, including the first installment of this series. And for those of you who are members of Pronomian, thank you so much. It is only because of you that I'm able to do a series like this. So today we're going to look at a little bit more of the, I would say, introductory elements of Acts 15. Now, in the first installment of this, in the introduction, I looked at some of the surrounding elements of Acts 15 and what the book really seems to be about, in my opinion, and that is that it is concerned with the Gentiles, whether or not the Gentiles are included in the covenant people of God, or can they be included in the covenant people of God? And this is really going to come to a head as we start to look at Acts 15. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the writing of the book of Galatians. I know that seems like it might be outside of the of this realm, but it's actually not. And then we're also going to look at hopefully the first few verses of Acts 15 itself. And so what I am going to do right now is we are going to well, let's just start talking about the argument of Acts 15 and Acts 11 and the book of Galatians. So here's the question at hand. The question at hand is whether or not the book of Galatians was written before or after the Jerusalem Council, which is Acts 15. Now, this is actually really important. It's important. I shouldn't say it's really important. And the thing is that in the commentary that I wrote on the book of Acts, which can be found on pronomian.com, I take the view that Galatians was written before Acts 15, but after Acts 11. Now, this is contrary to much of scholarship. Most scholars today take the view that Acts 15 takes place and then Galatians is written. So Paul is actually talking about the various the various elements of the Jerusalem Council and the conclusions that come to pass from the Jerusalem Council. And I give a lot of different references, including scholars that take the view that it was written out, that Galatians was written after Acts 15. Notably, I mention Craig Keener, who gives 8 different reasons why he believes that it was written after Acts 15 instead of before Acts 15. Now, I take the writing of Galatians in my book, at least, and I'm still kind of weighing the options. I think it makes more sense simply because of the arguments that are made, and we need to break this down a little bit. So what happens in Acts 11 is that Peter, let's just go there real quick. Let's go to Acts 11, and we will, I'll bring this up for you in just a second. Let me get there. Okay, let me move this over for you so you can see where I'm at. So here we are. We're in Acts 11. As you can see, Peter reports the whole account of Acts 10 to the people in Judea. It says, now the apostles and the brothers who were throughout Judea heard the Gentiles also to receive the word of God. So when Peter went up to Jerusalem, the circumcision party, now remember that last time we talked about this right here, this is simply the word, the circumcision, criticized him saying, you went to uncircumcised men and ate with them. Okay. So this right here is important for our discussion, but Peter began to explain it to them in order. And then he goes through the vision and he goes through all of these things. Now, we'll come down here to, 27 right here. Acts 11:27. It says, now in these days, prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch, and one of them, named Agabus, stood up and foretold by the Spirit that there would be a great famine over all the world. This took place in the days of Claudius. So the disciples determined, everyone according to his ability, to send relief to the brothers living in Judea. And they did so, sending it to the elders by the hand of Barnabas and Paul, or Saul at this, they're still calling him Saul. Okay, so this is fine. And basically, the argument here that I am proposing is that Galatians is written after this event. So he goes up. I think that he's talking to the elders. And then after this, he goes back to Antioch, and this is when Acts 15 happens. And then he goes back to Jerusalem another time. Keener makes the argument that this would mean that he went and talked to the Jerusalem council about the same thing twice. However, I actually disagree with this, and the reason why is because I think that what's happening here, in terms of the debate that Paul is having, is actually, I think it's two different debates. Okay, and I'm going to read from my commentary. And here we go. So let's bring this up. Right here, starting with Keener. Keener makes the point that if the famine journey hypothesis is correct, there were two meetings about the same issue, which seems implausible. The view assumes the topics were the same, which I do not find to be the case. According to Galatians 2, Paul presents the understanding that the gospel is for the Gentiles as well. Quote, and this is from Galatians 2, 7 through 8. It says, on the contrary, when they saw that I had been entrusted with the gospel to the circumcised, just as Peter had been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, or I'm sorry, to the circumcised rather, for he who worked through Peter for his apostolic ministry to the circumcised worked also through me for mine to the Gentiles. Keener associates this passage with Acts 15, 19 through 20, which says, therefore, my judgment is that we should not trouble those of the Gentiles who turn to God, but should write to them to abstain from things polluted to idols and from sexual immorality and from what has been strangled and from blood. Okay, we're going to get to all of that, by the way. This, I believe, is a mixing of two different arguments. In Galatians 2, Paul is presenting the case to the council that the gospel message is not only for Israel, but is for the nations as well. This right here is a very important piece of what I think is the puzzle here, at least for this chronology, but I think it also works into the entirety of the point of Acts 15 and a lot of what Paul says throughout his letters. Okay, so let's keep going. A theology that is still in its infant stages, and that also is important. And this theology is still in its infant stages at the time and is not fully worked out. Paul admits this in verse 2. He says in Galatians 2:2, I went up because of a revelation and set before them. So this revelation, I think, is possibly a revelation of the famine, though privately before those who seemed influential, the gospel that I proclaim among the Gentiles in order to make sure I was not running or had not run in vain. Okay, I'm going to keep going here for just a little bit. The death resurrection of the Messiah was not only a payment to save the Jews, but rather was the promise given to Abraham that all the nations of the earth would be blessed. Paul states this directly in Galatians 3:8 when he proclaims the gospel message. Okay, and I quote Galatians 3:8 there. The Jerusalem Council of Acts 15, however, is not asking if Gentiles are included in the gospel message, but rather if they need to formally convert to receive this promise. Okay, so this is the tipping of my hand here, and ultimately, you're going to see that this is my hypothesis for, for Acts 15. Ultimately, what I'm trying to say here for us today is this: that it seems plausible to me. We'll get into Galatians here in just a second. It seems plausible to me, however, that Paul goes up to Jerusalem during the revelation that there was going to be a famine. They take an offering up to them. And while he's there, he talks to the Jerusalem council. Now, this is not directly recorded as is directly recorded the Jerusalem council of Acts 15. However, I think that he talks to them and says, look, I think that the Gentiles are included in the covenant people of God. And this is done not by works of the law. We could talk for days about Galatians and the term works of the law. Maybe we'll get into that a little bit, but ultimately, rather, it is done by faith. The Gentiles are saved by faith. So are the Gentiles included in the covenant people of God? And I think that the answer is yes. And so then the real question is whether or not, so then when he goes back to Antioch, people come down and say, unless you were circumcised according to the custom of Moses. We're going to talk about this too in just a second. The Gentiles cannot be saved. So at this point, I don't think it's whether or not the Gentiles are allowed into the covenant people of God or not, but whether or not they have to be circumcised before they are considered to be in the covenant people of God. And it might seem like it's just a little twist, but I think that it's a big enough twist that Paul has to go back up to Jerusalem to talk about this. In other words, do the Gentiles have to convert to Judaism, convert to one of the Judaisms to be considered the covenant people of God, or are they considered the covenant people of God beforehand? Now, this is already talked about at some length, I think, in the first meeting that Paul has when he goes up for the famine. Now, once again, I need to stress that I am pushing against the mainstream view of when the book of Galatians was actually written. I certainly, as my father always says, I certainly would not follow my sword for this view. Simply means that this is not something that I'm necessarily going to fight too hard on. If people believe that Galatians was written after Acts 15, that's fine. I can actually see how it fits in both ways. I can see how both of these could be the case. However, let's go to Galatians now, and let's look. Let's see here. I'll switch this over, and then I will bring this up here. Okay. So then after 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along with me. I went up because of the revelation and set before them, though privately, before those who seemed influential, the gospel that I proclaimed among the Gentiles, in order to make sure I was not running or had not run in vain. We already read this. Going on now in verse 3, but even Titus, who was with me, was not forced to be circumcised. Now, this is interesting. What does that mean? Does it mean that he was not forced to be physically circumcised, or does it mean that he was not forced to go through a ritual of conversion, though he was a Greek? So was he not compelled or forced to be circumcised? In other words, did he eventually have the foreskin of his reproductive organ cut away as a sign that the Messiah of the Messiah, or did he not? Or is it simply that he was not forced to be ritually converted as the Jews had required? Well, that's a good question. And I don't think it's one that we can necessarily answer. Yet, because of false brothers secretly brought in, who slipped in to spy out our freedom that we have in Christ Jesus, so that they might bring us into slavery, to them we did not yield in submission even for a moment, so that the truth of the gospel might be preserved for you. Now, I mean, honestly, let's just be blunt here. This seems like it could be talking about the beginning of Acts 15, right? That these people came down and were saying that, that they were trying to basically say, no, this isn't right. However, it doesn't seem like this is secret. The Acts 15, the beginning of Acts 15. Anyway, okay. And from those who seem to be influential, what they were makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality. Those, I say, who seemed influential added nothing to me. On the contrary, when they saw that I had been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been entrusted with the gospel to the circumcised, for he who worked through Peter for his apostolic ministry to the circumcised worked also through me for mine to the Gentiles. And when James and Cephas, that is Peter, and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that was given to me, they gave the right hand of fellowship to Barnabas and me, that we should go to the Gentiles, and they too to the circumcised. Only they asked us to remember the poor, the very thing I was eager to do. Okay, so this is when it starts to get really interesting. But when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, he was eating with the Gentiles. But when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. And this is actually, these verses right here, 12 and 13 of Galatians, is actually one of the reasons that we can see that the term circumcision does not always mean the cutting away of the foreskin of the male organ of procreation, because he says they separated, fearing the circumcision party. The notion has been put forward before that the circumcision party means the Jews. However, in the very next verse it says, and the rest of the Jews. So were these Jews right here, were they not actually circumcised? Or were they just not part of a group? This is why your ESV, and I'm reading out of the ESV, by the way, this is why the ESV supplies this word party for you right here. And it even tells you that, fearing those of the circumcision is how it probably should actually be translated. However, they add this party because of this line right here. because of the rest of the Jews acted hypocritically along with them, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. But when I saw that their conduct was not in step with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas before them all, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you force the Gentiles to live like Jews? Okay, so he goes on to talk now a lot about justification by faith. One of the things that needs to probably be, this is outside of the scope of this study, but we could look into, Rob Van Hoff has worked pretty extensively on this, but the term works of the law is found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in the rule of the community, and it never refers to laws of Torah. It always refers to man-made rules. So works of the law in the Dead Sea Scrolls never refers to the works of, or to the laws of Torah. It only refers to the laws of the community. That, I think, is very important. And I think it's important for, I think it's more important for the study of Galatians than it is for our study, because we don't find this term works of the law in Acts 15. However, we find something else that we're going to talk about in just a second. All this to say, Paul then goes on in Galatians 3 to talk about how Abraham was saved by faith. And he was saved by faith before he did a work. And what was that work? Circumcision. This, I think, is actually very important. It's important no matter if we take the writing of Galatians before Acts 15 or after Acts 15. No matter which way we want to lean on this. And like I said at the very beginning of this video, I'm still kind of weighing the two options. When I wrote my commentary, I did take the view that it was written before Acts 15. However, I'm not very solid on that. I could be convinced the other way. But ultimately, the point simply is that I am trying to bring up here is that the book of Galatians, and one of the things that is really interesting about the book of Galatians is that Paul does not talk about the 4 prohibitions that we're going to read about in Acts 15. Why wouldn't he do that? And that's one of the reasons that I think it's possible that he wrote the letter before Acts 15. It's not a slam dunk. And actually, one of the things that I write in my commentary is that Paul actually talks about the findings of the Jerusalem Council in multiple books. And he does that in Ephesians. He does that in Galatians, no matter when that was written, and and what I'm saying, even if Galatians was written before Acts 15, what I'm saying is that he's starting to form this theology already, and he's starting to write about it. And even the book of Romans, right? We see the inclusion of the Gentiles in Romans 9 through 11, and throughout the whole book, right? We see this idea that the Gentiles are included in the covenant people of God. Okay, so let's then go on. I want to now move to, pardon me, give me just a second here. I want to move to, wrong one. We're going to move here to Acts 15. Let's do it. So all of that to say that I think that it is interesting that Paul is writing about these things in the book of Galatians, no matter where we put it. Okay. We are going to get through possibly the first verse of Acts 15. And this specific installment is probably going to be a bit shorter than the first one. The first one was about an hour long, and we're probably going to hit about a half an hour on this one. But then we're going to start to get into the meat of Acts 15. So we're right here, Acts 15:1. I'm in the ESV, as I have already stated. But some men came down from Judea and were teaching the brothers, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. So, we don't know who these men are. I have suggested before that this is possibly disciples of James, because James is kind of the one who listens and then, he's kind of the ringleader, it seems, of it seems as though there are people that he might disagree with that he reprimands at other times. Anyway, so that's neither here nor there, because this can't be proved one way or the other. But these men come down from Judea, and they say, unless you are circumcised. Now, here is where we need to stop and ask ourselves, what are they actually saying? Are they talking about, let's back up for just a second. I would say that the standard Christian view among churches and throughout history has been that this phrase, circumcise, specifically at the beginning of Acts 15, is talking about the physical act of circumcision. Now we've seen many within theology say that circumcision is done away with, and the teachings from Paul and the teachings here in Acts 15 prove that circumcision, that those in the church should not be practicing or don't have to practice circumcision anymore. I find this to be an interesting view, but I think it's predicated on the notion that passages like this are talking about the physical act of circumcision, whereas I don't actually think that that's what it's talking about. In this passage, I think what is actually being said is unless a person converts, formally converts, according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. Now, according to the custom of Moses, this is where a lot of people are taking this term, circumcised, to mean the physical act of circumcision because of this term, the custom of Moses. Now, my good friend and one of my teachers, Rob Van Hoff, and my co-host on Messiah Matters, takes a different view than me on this, as does my father. My father hasn't has not specifically given the explanation that I'm going to give on this term, the custom of Moses. However, this is something that I've kind of worked on my own to come to my own understanding of this. So it's by far not accepted across the board. In fact, let's go to my commentary and I'll give you a little taste of what Van Hoff, my friend and colleague, says about this. He says, okay, well, starting right up, I don't know if you can see this or not, starting right here, I say this. The scene for the entire chapter is set in verse 1 as the men that come to Antioch are challenging the gospel message of salvation. The phrase that cannot be overlooked in this verse is the term according to the custom of Moses. This is the only use of this exact phrase that I could find in all of the first century literature. Now, it's important that we look at this footnote right here. There is a similar phrase used in Acts 6:14, which states, "For we have heard him say that this Jesus of Nazareth will destroy this place and will change the customs that Moses delivered to us." But this is not the exact, it's not a word for word Greek quote of the same. We can't parallel them exactly. So Rob Van Hoff, this is my friend and colleague, has argued that, and this is a quote from Van Hoff himself, the halakha being taught here consists of what Greek grammarians call a third-class condition. Daniel Wallace cites Boyarin's larger category of this type of construction, with no indication of fulfillment. In other words, this was not a salvation invitation. And in the paper that I am quoting here, this is very important for Van Hoff's conclusion. So it's in other words, this was not a salvation invitation to the Gentiles on the condition of circumcision, as we shall see. It was an attempt to define, quote, the saved, that is, true Israel, as those who had been circumcised according to the custom of Moses. I'm going to show you this cross-reference here. This is on Torah Resource, and you can go read this article by my friend Rob. It's called Circumcision in the Second Temple Period, and you can find it on Torah Resource. Okay, so, end quote from Van Hoff. And now we're going to go on. Van Hoff goes on to suggest that this particular group was teaching that unless a man was circumcised on the 8th day according to the Torah, he cannot be saved. In other words, this group believed that there was no way for a Gentile to inherit eternal life. And this is Van Hoff's argument, that this group was coming down and saying, nope, there's no way of salvation for the Gentiles. Now, this actually fits well with Paul's teaching that no, the Gentiles are included in the covenant. But it also seems to go against the notion. Now, in fairness to Rob is saying that this is a specific sect that believed a specific teaching, and they were different from all the other sects. But it seems that, and honestly, I mean, his paper is certainly worth a read, and I would encourage people to go read it. But I digress. I tend to disagree with this particular view. Okay, so we're starting right here. The conversion was not an option. This view is dependent on the understanding that the term custom of Moses means adherence to the Mosaic law. This view may be supported by the absence of inclusion and or the little that is said about conversion into the sect of the Dead Sea Scrolls community. Okay, and I talked there about the notion that it's possible that the Dead Sea Scroll community actually did allow Gentiles in, but that can be debated. Nevertheless, I personally am not convinced the term custom of Moses is a reference to the written Torah. Rather, I understand the term to be a reference to man-made laws, a belief shared with others. Now, this is where I'm going to reference Bach, Daniel Bach. Darrell Bach, Darrell Bach. Also, and this is what he says, also mentioned is the custom of Moses. This is a dative of cause or rule, quote, because of the custom of Moses, or according to the custom of Moses. This phrase may refer to Jewish tradition, but this is uncertain since the command to be circumcised comes directly from the law itself, if issued in connection with the patriarch Abraham, and he references Genesis 17:10 through 14. Now, if you've watched this series, sorry I didn't have that quote up there for you. If you've watched the first part of this series, you know what I'm going to say right now. What I'm going to say is that yes, but Bach has taken this term circumcision to mean the physical act of cutting away the foreskin of the reproductive organ. If we take this term circumcision to mean a man-made ritual that is not found in the Torah, a man-made ritual of conversion, then custom of Moses could certainly mean tradition. It wouldn't have to mean the Torah. The reason that Bach sees this as meaning the Torah is because he's taking the term circumcision as, he's just taking it as circumcision. He's not taking it as a possible means of conversion. In other words, a ritual of conversion that includes much more than just circumcision, right? And we see this, for instance, in Josephus and the story of Isaac, and how this person wanted to become Jewish, and the final act of becoming a Jew, becoming of the bloodline of the Jews, is this act of circumcision. Okay, so ultimately, I think that Bach is on the right track here. He's on the right track that this could in fact mean tradition. However, since he is taking circumcision as meaning the physical act of cutting away the foreskin, he is missing the idea that it could mean a man-made ritual of conversion. Okay. So, I'm going to support my view that custom of Moses means a tradition and not something from the Torah. And I'm going to do that by looking at various times that the word custom is used in the apostolic scriptures. Let's go back to my commentary here. I think this is actually going to help. Although Bach notes the term custom of Moses could be a reference to man-made traditions, he assumes the term circumcision is the physical act prescribed in the Torah, something we will discuss below. The word used for custom is used 11 times in the apostolic scriptures, meaning the New Testament here, not including our verse. All but 2 are by the hand of Luke. The 2 references that are made outside of Luke's work are clearly speaking about man-made customs and not things found within the Torah. And here are the 2 references that use that term custom outside of Luke's writings. It says in John 19:14, so they took the body of Jesus and bound it in linen clothes with spices, as is the burial custom of the Jews. So the burial custom of the Jews, this is not found obviously in Torah. Hebrews 10:25, not neglecting to meet together as is the custom of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. So this seems to be even contrary to Torah, right? The custom of some is not to get together on the Sabbath, but rather it is the teaching of the Torah that a person should assemble together. So these are the 2 references outside of the Torah, and obviously they are not part of the Torah. Luke's use of the word is mixed, but it is mostly in reference to man-made tradition. Luke 1:9, 22:39, Acts 16:31, 25:16, 26:3 are all speaking of man-made tradition / customs and not about the commandments of Torah. And I'm not going to read those, but I'd encourage you, if you have any questions about that, go ahead and look up those references. This leaves 3 verses that are somewhat ambiguous. Let's read them. And when he was 12 years old, they went up according to custom, Luke 2:42. Now this one, the reason that this is ambiguous is because is it their custom to go up because it was the Passover? Yeah, probably. Or should we see this as because he was 12 years old? In other words, there's some kind of coming of age that's going on, so they're going to take him up to the temple. That's why it's ambiguous. It's not. Certainly will give. Will concede that the going up for the custom or for the festival of Passover is certainly a command. But the question that is being asked now is Luke talking about going up because it's Passover? Is that the custom, or is it because he is 12 that they are going up, and that is the custom? They're going up because he's 12. The second one is Acts 6:14. It says, "For we have heard him say that this Jesus of Nazareth will destroy this place and will change the customs that Moses delivered to us." This one is probably, I would argue that it's actually probably talking about the customs of Moses being of Torah. So this would probably be one out of the 11 times that the term custom is used, that this would actually refer to the actual Torah. And then after 3 days, he called together the local leaders of the Jews, and when they had gathered, he said to them, "Brothers, though I had done nothing against our people or the customs of our fathers, yet I was delivered as a prisoner from Jerusalem into the hands of the Romans." This too could be argued that that Paul is talking about the traditions, since in Acts 21. It is argued that let's see here. In Acts 21, it is argued that Paul is speaking against the fathers and against circumcision. Now, what that means, once again, this could mean man-made tradition, or it could mean the physical act of circumcision. So this right here, this is why I say that this is ambiguous. We don't know whether or not they're talking about, whether or not he's talking about the customs, meaning the traditions of the fathers, or whether or not he's meaning the actual commands of Torah. And so ultimately, I would say that we have one passage in all of the New Testament, all of the apostolic scriptures, that would suggest to us that would correlate with the actual customs being laws of Torah. The other 10, and definitely the other 9, certainly 8, but possibly 9, are talking about traditions of men. And so this is one of the reasons that I think when we look at the term custom of Moses in Acts 15:1, I don't think that we should be so quick to think that this means that it is the laws of Torah. I think that actually what's happening here is Luke is writing down, as the majority of the times that he writes this word customs, I think that he's talking about the traditions of the fathers, and that these are not actually of the Torah. And I think that this is really where Paul is starting to wrestle. He's starting to wrestle between the man-made tradition and traditions as a whole, the man-made traditions, and following Christ, and what is true theology, what is truly right. And I think that Paul has come to this understanding that, well, the tradition has been that the Gentiles are not included into the covenant people of God unless they are circumcised, and that he's starting to rethink that. He's seeing Abraham as being included into the covenant people of God before he's circumcised. This is the point that he makes in Galatians 3, that Paul comes to faith before he's circumcised, and he's seen as a covenant member before the circumcision takes place. And what he's saying is, well, Abraham was a Gentile, and so does this mean that he had salvation before circumcision? Well, what about the other Gentiles? What about the fact that Peter proclaims that the Holy Spirit filled these Gentiles before they were circumcised? So what does this mean? And before they were baptized. What does that mean? And so he's wrestling with these things. So all of that to say, I think that this term "custom of Moses" in Acts 15:1 should be seen as traditions. And if that is the case, what we would see here, And I mean, let's paraphrase this according to the way that I'm understanding the cultural aspect and the cultural surroundings of these words. But some came down from Judea and were teaching, brothers, unless you convert according to our tradition, you cannot be saved. So unless you are circumcised, circumcision being a shorthand for ritually convert, a man-made tradition, according to the custom of Moses, which I think means traditions of the fathers or man-made tradition, you cannot be saved. This takes on a whole different meaning now when we start to look at Acts 15. Because now it's not whether or not the physical act of circumcision saves a person or not, although it should certainly be noted that the physical act of circumcision was the final step in that man-made tradition of conversion. But rather, it's that that the Gentiles have to go through this man-made ritual of conversion to be saved. Now, the funny thing is that we still see this in modern day Judaism and in Messianic Judaism, right? Like they're not going to say unless you are convert, you can't be saved. That's not what they'll say. But we still have some of the underpinnings of this in the Messianic movement, right? Unless you formally convert according to our custom, your child cannot have a bar mitzvah. Unless you formally convert according to our man-made tradition, you can't get up and read the Torah in the congregation. Unless you formally convert according to our custom, you can't say these prayers. You have to say this set of prayers. So the notion that this is far-fetched, that like it even comes into our congregations today, into people into believers who are saying that they believe in the apostolic scriptures, they're still getting hung up in the exact same kind of theology, maybe not to the extent of saying a person isn't saved, but that a person is a lower class citizen, that they are not part of the fold of Israel unless they have this formal conversion. Okay, I think that's where I'm going to leave it today. Next week, we are going to get into the actual text we're going to go even farther into the text, and we're going to look, hopefully we'll start getting into some of these regulations. And as I said in the video last week, one of the main things the reason that I started looking at this was because of a article that I received in this month's JETS, the Journal of the Evangelical Theological Society, which I think shows the lack of options that the mainstream Christian church currently has when they take the view that this passage is saying that the Torah is done away with. We're going to talk also about the fact that some people say that this isn't about sanctification at all. I think that that's exactly what Acts 15 gets into, is the notion of sanctification. I think that that Paul comes and he says, no, a person is not saved by their bloodline, and that Gentiles can come into the covenant people of God through faith. But then what about the Torah? What about the Torah of Moses? What about the actual commands? Do they have to keep the law of Moses? And I think that this is exactly what Paul and the Jerusalem Council are hashing out, and I think that there is a very definitive answer, and I think it's one that so many within mainstream Christianity do not want to see because it doesn't match their theology. However, I think it is in fact the easiest reading of the text. All right, thank you so much for being a part of this. Thank you to the members of Pronomian.com who are really making it so that I'm able to put this study together, and all the materials that I'm putting together on Pronomian.com. It is because of you that I'm able to do that, and I thank you very much. If you'd like to become a member, you can do so on Pronomian.com. All right, I will see you next week as we look further at Acts 15. Thanks so much.